The sound of metal clashing rang out shrilly. Clang! The heavy iron door slowly closed, its hinges screeching like a beast swallowing its prey. In that moment, all sounds from the outside world seemed to be cut off. All that remained was a thick, heavy silence, so heavy that he could hear every beat of his own heart. Darkness enveloped him. The pale yellow light from the single light bulb hanging precariously in the middle of the ceiling flickered, as if it could go out at any moment. The smell of mold from the stained walls and the cold cement floor rushed into his nose. He took a breath, but not to find life, but to realize that from this moment on, he belonged to a different world, a world of chains and solitude. He sat down on the rickety iron bed, the thin blanket a dingy yellow. Every creak from the bed frame seemed to repeat the mistakes that had brought him here. He closed his eyes, but the image of the moment he was handcuffed was still vivid. His mother's disappointed eyes, the tears streaming down her old face, and the shouts of the people he once called friends who turned their backs on him when he fell. You destroyed your own life. A cold voice echoed in his head, like a knife twisting deep into his heart. He didn't know if it was the voice of his conscience or a part of the darkness within him mocking him. In the solitary confinement room, time passed so slowly that he couldn't guess how long he had been there. An hour? A day? Or just a few minutes? He only knew that every moment was like a knife wound to his soul. He used to think he was strong, capable of facing any situation. But here, before 4 cold walls and a locked iron door, he realized he was nothing but a prisoner, not only by iron bars, but also by his own sins. He thought of all he had lost: freedom, honor, friends, family. But what was more painful was the loss of hope, because once hope dies, a person is just a breathing corpse. The sound of water dripping from a rusty pipe went drip, drip, echoing regularly in the small space. He lay on his back, looking up at the ceiling full of cobwebs. A question echoed in his head, at first a whisper, but becoming clearer and clearer. What if this is the end of my life? A feeling of despair tightened around his heart. He began to imagine his remaining days locked in solitude and finally disappearing without anyone remembering him. He gave a bitter laugh, but the laugh only made the corners of his mouth crack more. Then in that silence, he suddenly remembered a vague memory. As a child, whenever he passed the church near his neighborhood, he would often hear the bells ringing on Sunday mornings. Once, an old woman in the neighborhood said to him, "My child, no matter how far you go astray, God still sees you and is waiting for you to come back." At the time, he just laughed it off, treating it as a superstitious old person story. But now, in the cold, solitary confinement room, those words echoed with strange clarity. He didn't know why he remembered that at this moment. Maybe it was because this was the first time he truly felt alone. There was no one to rely on, no plan to cling to. All that was left was a lingering question. Is there anyone out there who still wants to save me? The darkness still surrounded him, but deep inside, a small ray of light had just flickered, fragile, weak, but enough for him to realize that even though this iron door had closed, who knows, one day it would open. Night fell like a thick black curtain, swallowing every faint ray of light in the solitary confinement room. All that remained was the sound of water dripping from the ceiling onto the cold cement floor, each drip, drip, echoing like the ticking of time, slow, long, and so heavy that it made him feel as if every second that passed was an agony. In that absolute silence, the sounds of the outside world completely disappeared. No more human voices, no more car noises, no more laughter or names being called. There was only him, in the echoes from deep within his own soul. At first, they were just fragmented thoughts, but as the night wore on, they became clearer, sharper like knives cutting into his mind. You deserve to be here. You are a failure. Your life is over. The accusations echoed relentlessly, as if someone was sitting right next to him whispering. But he knew no one was there. It was just him judging himself. He thought about the mistakes that had led him here, the fights, the times he chose shortcuts instead of patiently rebuilding his life. He remembered the faces, his mother with her red eyes, his old friend who had advised him many times, but he had ignored, and also the people who had pulled him down into this abyss. But no matter who he remembered, the final image was always himself in a shattered mirror, looking back with eyes of both regret and powerlessness. That night, for the first time, he asked himself a question he had never dared to think of before. Am I still worth living? The question didn't just appear once and disappear. It repeated itself, like an echo in a dead-end tunnel. Every time he thought about it, he felt a heaviness in his chest, as if an invisible hand was squeezing his heart. The more he tried to sleep to escape, the more he was woken up by nightmares. In his dreams, he saw himself running endlessly down a dark corridor. Every door he opened led only to an empty, cold room, and finally, another solitary confinement room. The night seemed endless. He curled up, holding his head, trying to chase away those voices. But the more he fought, the clearer they became. He realized that the scariest thing about prison was not the iron bars or the four cold walls. It was being locked up alone with his own thoughts. At some point near dawn, in a state of extreme exhaustion, he suddenly whispered in the darkness, "If there's anyone out there who can hear me, please save me." He didn't know who he was talking to, but that was the first time, in the thick darkness, a faint ray of light flickered. Not a clear hope, but just a longing to be heard by someone. And he had no idea. That was the first step on a journey he had never imagined. Images of the past rushed back like a blurred film, mixed with the sighs of the darkness. He leaned his head against the cold wall, closed his eyes, and let his memories lead him back in time. As a child, he never knew what a complete family meal was like. His father left when he was 4, and his mother struggled alone, working and raising him. But the hardship made her harsh. The scolding and beatings were deeply ingrained in the mind of the boy back then. He grew up with a heart full of scratches and a fragile belief that no one loved him. In middle school, he began to seek validation from friends. To avoid being seen as weak, he learned to act tough and reckless. He started smoking when he was 13 and drank alcohol for the first time at 14. The feeling of being drunk and carefree gave him an illusion that he was in control of his life. At 15, he dropped out of school. The streets became his classroom, and his gang friends were the teachers who taught him how to live. They taught him how to shoplift, how to fight, how to look at people with a threatening gaze. He began to feel valuable when others were afraid of him or respected him. But deep inside, there was a void that nothing could fill. At 17, he was arrested for the first time for a fight that caused injury. The few months in the detention center didn't change him. On the contrary, when he got out, he became more stubborn and hardened. He believed that society had closed its doors on him and that he had no other path than a life of crime. Then one day, during a daring robbery, everything collapsed. The wailing sirens, the sound of footsteps chasing him, and the hands that tightened around his wrists with cold handcuffs. He clearly remembered the feeling of the metal tightening on his skin, like an indelible mark. Now, sitting in the solitary confinement room, he saw all those memories as interconnected links, pulling him down into the abyss. It wasn't a single mistake that brought him here, but a series of wrong choices, of turning his back on opportunities to start over. He suddenly felt a lump in his throat. Hot tears streamed down, not out of fear, but out of the pain of realizing that he had lost himself a long time ago. He asked himself, if I had made a different choice that day, would things have been different? But the answer never came. The darkness in the cell seemed to be listening to the sobs of a broken man. He knew he was standing at a new crossroads, to continue to slide or to find a reason to stand up. But at this moment, he didn't know that the answer would come from a source he had never expected. The sound of rain pattering on the old tin roof of the solitary confinement room was like slow knocking on his mind. Each drop that fell reminded him that time was still passing. But for him, it was passing in a cold gray, promising no dawn. The darkness in the room was so thick that he couldn't distinguish between night and day. There was only the sound of rain and the smell of mold from the decayed stone walls. On that day, the despair was at its highest since he had been locked up here. There were no more footsteps in the corridor, No more calls for meals, no more human sounds, only him and the four bare walls. The loneliness was suffocating him. The feeling was not just about being alone, but about being cut off from the world, from every ray of hope. In his head, memories of his sinful and mistaken days rushed back. The faces of the people he had hurt, the opportunities he had lost, the wrong decisions that had pushed him into this abyss. Everything appeared so clearly, like a slow-motion film. He felt angry at himself, hated his fate, and also was afraid. Afraid that if one day he died here, no one would remember, no one would pity him. Afraid that his life would end like a number erased from a page, and no one would bother to read it again. Suddenly, he looked up at the ceiling. Rainwater was leaking from a small crack in the roof, falling in drops, reflecting the weak light from the corridor. In that moment, a very strange thought appeared in his head. A thought he had never allowed himself to think before. Is God real? He had never believed in religion. From a young age, the only belief he had was in himself. But now that belief had shattered. And when all his support had collapsed, he suddenly found himself searching for some invisible hand. Even if just to pull him back, not to let him drift away forever. He slowly whispered, almost afraid of his own voice echoing in the quiet space. God, if you are real, please give me a reason to live. The sentence was short, clumsy, and full of doubt, but it came from the bottom of his heart, a sincere cry for help in the cold, rainy night. He didn't expect a miracle to happen immediately. He just hoped, if someone really heard it, he would understand how exhausted he was. After that prayer, something strange happened. It wasn't a brilliant light that appeared or chains that fell off. It was just, in his heart, the storm of emotions suddenly slowed down. The rain outside sounded softer, and his breathing became lighter. For the first time in many weeks, he closed his eyes without feeling afraid. He didn't know what tomorrow would be like, but in that moment, a small seed had been planted in his soul, the seed of a faith he had never had. And he didn't know that that clumsy prayer would become the starting point for a journey that would change his entire life. That morning, like every other morning in the damp and cold solitary confinement room, he sat huddled in the corner. The clinking of keys opening the corridor door, the footsteps of the guard, and the slamming of the iron door at the end of the hall, all were a familiar sad song. But today, something was different. Just as he looked up, a thin streak of light filtered through the narrow crack in the iron door. The light was not strong, not dazzling, but it shone directly into the dark corner where he was sitting. Tiny specks of dust floated in that beam of light as if dancing in silence. He suddenly felt a strange feeling in his heart. The freezing cold from the cement floor seemed to disappear. It was replaced by an indescribable warmth, spreading from his chest throughout his body. He didn't know why. It was just that, in that moment, all the noise, all the despair, all the heavy memories moved away. The room was still four bare walls, but he felt something he had never had: peace. He reached out his hand to gently touch the beam of light, as if afraid it would disappear. His fingers trembled, not from the cold, but from a new feeling rushing in, a ray of hope. Deep in his heart, a thought quietly echoed, "I am here." He didn't hear it with his ears, but his heart felt it clearly. Tears unexpectedly streamed down his face. He didn't understand why he was crying. He only knew that those tears were no longer heavy with despair, but were light as if they were washing away the dirt in his soul. That day, he didn't talk to anyone, didn't ask for extra food, and didn't try to kill time as usual. He just sat silently, looking at the light and feeling it. With each passing minute, he became more certain of one thing: something had changed. It wasn't that the prison had disappeared. It wasn't that the sentence had been erased. But deep in his heart, he knew he had found something more precious than external freedom: a hope to keep living. From that moment on, the solitary confinement room was no longer the abyss that drowned him, but became the place where he began a new journey, the journey of seeking the source of the light that had just touched him that morning. That day, the guard gave him a small package without saying a word. In the package was only a thin book, its cover frayed, the pages yellowed and many torn at the corners. He opened it and immediately recognized it as a Bible. In the corner of the cover were a few handwritten words, "Be strong and courageous." He guessed this was a gift from a fellow inmate he had once helped, or someone anonymous who wanted to give him hope. At first, he held the book with mixed feelings. His mind was still full of doubt. But since there was nothing else to kill time in the solitary confinement room, he opened it and read page by page. The words seemed to be speaking directly to him. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." He stopped at that sentence for a long time. It felt like an invisible hand had been placed on my shoulder, warm and gentle. He had never heard anyone promise to give him rest. From a young age, he had only heard scolding, criticism, or threats. In the nights that followed, he read the Bible like a hungry person searching for bread. Every page, no matter how torn or faded, contained promises of forgiveness, freedom of the soul, and unconditional love. He began to feel that he was no longer a forgotten person. There were passages that made him cry, not because of regret for the sins he had committed, but because he realized there was still a God who accepted him even when he was at the lowest point of his life. He saw his own image in the Bible's characters, the lost, the sinners, but who were transformed when they met God. That old, torn Bible opened up a new world for him. It was not just paper and ink. It was the key that unlocked the invisible prison door in his mind. He understood that even when he was locked between four cold walls, his soul could still be free. From that day on, the Bible became the most precious thing he had. He placed it under his pillow every time he slept, as if keeping a small source of light close to him that was enough to dispel all the darkness of the solitary confinement room. He sat silently in the corner of the solitary confinement room, the thin paper in his hand trembling slightly with his breath. The ink was smudged in a few places from the writer's tears, but for him, those smudges were more beautiful than any painting he had ever seen in his life. Before, he had often thought about contacting his family, but the fear of being rejected always held his hand captive. He imagined the scene of his letter being torn to shreds or thrown into the fire, because deep down he believed that he had long ago burned all the bridges back home with his own hands. But in the days of reading the old torn Bible, one verse touched his heart deeply. "If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness." Those words were like an arrow that pierced the hard shell of his heart. He decided to write, not to be forgiven, but to express his sincere repentance. He sent the letter, and then he lived through long, weary days of waiting. Every time he heard the guard's footsteps approaching, his heart would beat fast. But then he would be disappointed when there was nothing for him. Until today, he trembled as he opened the envelope. The first line made him hold his breath. "My son, we have been waiting for these words for a long time." There was no condemnation, no curse, only the warmth of family love seeping through every word. His mother wrote that she had cried all the time she was reading the letter, but they were tears of hope. She said that the family was still praying for him, that the door of their home was always open, and that their love had never left him. He couldn't hold it in anymore. Hot tears streamed down, falling onto the letter as if to merge with his mother's tears. He felt a great weight lifted from his shoulders. In the cramped cell, he suddenly felt as if he was standing in the middle of a vast field, where light shone everywhere. Forgiveness came not only from his family, but also from the God he had just begun to believe in. And in that moment, he understood that another door had opened, the door of inner freedom, even though he was still behind iron bars on the outside. The long days in solitary confinement taught him more than a lifetime of freedom before that. At first, he still thought that freedom meant being able to walk out of these four walls, breathe the air outside, and do whatever he wanted. But the longer he stayed here, the more he read the Bible and prayed, the more he realized a different truth. True freedom begins from within. There were nights so silent that he could hear his own heartbeat clearly. In that darkness, he remembered every mistake he had made, every harsh word, every action that had hurt others. Before, he used to find ways to blame circumstances, this person or that person, or fate itself. But now the light of God's word shone on him, and he could no longer escape the truth. He saw that he was not just a prisoner confined by iron locks, but also a prisoner of his own soul, bound by hatred, greed, and sin. Every verse of the Bible he read seemed to speak directly to his situation. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. John 8:36. Those words were like a key that unlocked the prison door within him. He began to understand that even if he was locked in a solitary confinement room, but if his soul was freed from the chains of sin, he was a free man. He also learned a lesson in patience. In prison, no one was in a hurry, no one was chasing time. On the outside, every day he had lived was a race to earn money, a race to prove himself, a race not to be left behind. But in this cold room, he only had one thing to do: wait. And in that waiting, he learned to listen to God's voice. One evening while he was praying, he felt a sense of peace envelop him, just like the day the sunlight shone into the room. It wasn't because the circumstances had changed. The door was still closed, the sentence was still there, but in his heart, a new sky had opened up. He no longer felt confined. He realized that freedom was not about getting out, but about letting go of the burdens in his heart. In the days that followed, he began to help other inmates. Some needed to hear a word of encouragement. Some needed to be told about the Bible verses he had just read. The cell, which had been filled with sighs and the sound of metal clashing, now had the added sound of conversation and soft laughter. He saw that life, even in the darkest place, could still shine if the human heart knew how to love. He understood that the greatest lesson God had taught him in this prison was, true freedom begins when we are forgiven and learn to forgive. In the cold prison block, people rarely shared deep things with each other. Everyone had their wounds and secrets, like invisible walls surrounding their hearts. But then he met him, the special inmate he later believed God had arranged. His name was Min. He was thin, but his eyes were bright and warm. Although he wore the same prison uniform as everyone else, there was something different about him. In a place where curses and the banging of iron bars were familiar sounds, he often sang softly, simple hymns, but full of hope. At first, he just thought it was a form of self-comfort from someone who couldn't handle the pressure. But gradually, he realized that whenever he heard that singing, his soul would calm down, as if the storm in his heart had temporarily subsided. One evening, when the whole room had fallen silent, Mr. Min started a conversation. His voice was deep and slow. "Do you believe that life can be started over?" He gave a bitter laugh. "Here? With someone like me? No." Mr. Min just smiled. "I used to think that too. Before I came here, I was a pastor. But then I stumbled, sinned, and lost everything. I lost faith in myself until I realized that God had never given up on me." He was silent. The man's story made him curious, but also wary. He was too used to empty promises and two-faced people. But that night, somehow, he wanted to keep listening. In the days that followed, they talked more. Mr. Min told him about his life, not hiding his mistakes, but also not leaving out the moments when God had lifted him up. He didn't preach with high-sounding words. He just told it with his own tears and smiles. Once he asked, "Have you ever read this verse? So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed." John 8:36. He shook his head. The man opened his old Bible and showed it to him. The pages were yellowed and many were torn, but the words were still clear. He read the verse over and over again. Truly free. It had been a long time since he had thought of this concept not as an open door, but as something that happened inside. In the evenings that followed, they read the Bible together. Mr. Min explained each verse, each word, relating them to the wounds in his heart. He didn't always believe it right away, but he felt the warmth of those words. Once Mr. Min said something he would never forget. "Here, we are all imprisoned, but there are two kinds of prisons. One is with iron bars and the other is with our own hearts. Iron bars can hold the body, but only God's forgiveness can open the heart." He didn't answer, but in his heart, a small ray of light had just flickered, and this time, he didn't want to extinguish it. The iron door made a dry clang as it was opened. The light from the corridor shone in, no longer blocked by the narrow crack in the door. He stood up, taking slow steps outside. After many months of being confined in the cramped room, the four walls seemed to be slowly receding behind him. But the strange thing was that he didn't feel heavy or resentful. Instead, there was a strange peace in his heart. He was moved to the general confinement area. Here, the sound of people talking, laughing, and even the shouts of the guards echoed everywhere. Compared to the almost absolute silence of solitary confinement, this place was like a different world. But for him, the biggest difference was not the space, but that his soul had been changed. The months in darkness, with his initial trembling prayers that gradually became steady, had planted a new seed in his heart. He no longer saw himself as an abandoned person, but as a person who was being led. In the brief conversations with his special inmate friend, the former pastor who had also stumbled, he had heard about the love of a God who never gives up on people. When he sat on the iron bed in the new cell, the noisy sounds around him could not disturb the inner peace. He began to think about the future. Before, he had never dared to think further than tomorrow, but now he believed that every day to come was a gift, not to be wasted, but to be lived fully for the God who had saved him from the abyss of despair. That evening, as the dim prison light shone down, he took out a blunt pencil and a small piece of paper he had hidden in his shirt pocket. He began to write, "I don't know how many more days I have here, but I know that when I walk out of this place, I will no longer be the old person. I will tell my story to anyone who is willing to listen. I will live to prove that no darkness is greater than his light." He smiled. For the first time in a long time, the smile was not forced, not hiding a pain, but came from a genuine hope. He had walked out of solitary confinement, but more importantly, he had walked out of the invisible prison that had once held his heart captive. In the early days in the general confinement area, he was still a bit lost. The space was bigger, more light came in, but the noise, arguments, and sudden shouts of the other inmates made it hard for him to concentrate. However, deep in his heart, he knew he was no longer the old person. Something had changed from deep within, like a fire that had been lit, and he didn't want it to be extinguished by circumstances. He began to carry the old worn Bible that the former pastor inmate had given him. At first, a few people mocked him. "Will reading that stuff get you out of here?" He just smiled, not arguing. He knew that what he received from God's word was not physical freedom, but freedom of the soul, something that no iron bars could ever imprison. Gradually, a few people became curious and sat with him. He told them stories from the Bible, about the prodigal son, about the thief on the cross who was forgiven by Jesus, about a God who does not despise or abandon anyone who comes to him. He didn't preach like a pastor, he just retold it as someone who had experienced the darkness and been led to the light. One evening, when the whole cell was in silence, a young inmate came to him. With a trembling voice, he confessed that he had wanted to end his life many times because he felt his guilt was too great. He placed a hand on the young man's shoulder and told him his own life story, the days of despair, the moments when it seemed there was no way out, and how God had touched his heart in the darkest place. The young man's tears fell, but this time not out of despair, but because a ray of hope had just been lit. In the days that followed, a small group formed. They read the Bible together, prayed for each other, and shared what was on their hearts. Some prayed for their families to be at peace. Some prayed for the strength to overcome addiction when they got out of prison. Some just wanted a peaceful night's sleep without dreaming of old mistakes. The wonderful thing was that gradually the atmosphere in the cell changed. The curses lessened, the arguments became less violent. The harshness of prison was still there, but somewhere a warmth began to spread, like a small lamp in the darkness. He realized that God had not only saved him from the abyss, but had also placed him here to be a witness to his grace. Prison was no longer the end of his life, but a field to sow the seeds of faith. And he knew that even though he was still within these four walls, his soul was living in a freedom that no one could take away. In the early days of living his faith within the four cold walls, he thought he had found a place of peace in his soul. But then, reality quickly proved that this new path was not easy. News of his change spread quickly in the prison. Some were curious, some were encouraging, but there were also many who mocked him. One afternoon, as he was reading the Bible in the corner of the room, a sneering laugh rang out. "Look at Saint here. What good is reading that stuff? You won't be any better off when you get out of prison." The words were like a knife twisting in his heart. A part of him wanted to react, to prove that he had truly changed. But another part reminded him of the words he had learned. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. He took a deep breath, looked up, and smiled. I read it to remember that any of us can start over, including me. Of course, not everyone accepted that answer. Some inmates even intentionally provoked him. They snatched his Bible, tore a page, and threw it on the floor. That time, he felt his blood rush to his face. All his life, he had been used to retaliating immediately when he was insulted. But in that moment, it was as if an invisible hand was placed on his shoulder, holding him back. He bent down to pick up each piece of paper, gently folding them, and didn't say a word. That evening, when he prayed, he confessed to God, I am so weak, I want to react, I want to defend myself, but please help me choose a different way of life. As the days went by, the mockery was still there, but its weight on his soul gradually lessened. He realized that challenges were not meant to defeat him, but were opportunities to refine his faith. One evening, the person who had torn his Bible unexpectedly came to him. He sat down in silence, then quietly said, The other day, I saw you didn't fight back, didn't curse. I was wondering, why? He smiled, looking straight into the other man's eyes. Because before, I was also a person who was quick to anger, but now I believe that forgiveness is stronger than retaliation. The other man didn't say anything else, just nodded and left. But from that day on, he no longer mocked him. He understood that every word, every action in prison was a testimony. And sometimes people don't need to hear a long sermon, they just need to see a steadfast heart. That was his first test. And he learned that faith is not just what you believe, but how you live in the face of opposition, doubt, and even contempt. That morning, the prison gate opened with a familiar sound, but the meaning was completely different. It was no longer the cold sound of a lock closing behind him, but the sound of an opening for a new journey. He stepped out, his feet trembling slightly, not from fear, but from emotion. In his hand was only a small bag, a few clothes, a few yellowed letters, and a worn Bible. But in his heart, he carried a priceless treasure, peace and freedom that no iron bars could take away. The sky that day seemed bluer than usual. The sunlight was no longer blocked by the cold, high wall, but stretched endlessly over his shoulders. He took a deep breath, letting each gust of wind enter his chest, carrying the smell of freedom, the smell of soil, of grass, of the open roads ahead. His family was waiting for him outside the gate. When they saw him, they burst into tears. The tight hugs were not just to make up for the years of separation, but also to confirm that he had truly returned, not just in body, but as a new person. They looked at him and noticed something strange. His eyes were brighter, more peaceful, and held a deep faith. He knew that today was not the end, but the beginning. The world outside still had many challenges, temptations, and suspicious looks. But he was no longer the old man, weak and lost. He had met God in the darkest place of his life, and it was He who had led him to the light. True freedom did not come from the prison door opening, but from the chains in his soul being broken. He looked up at the sky and whispered a prayer of thanks. Lord, I am free because of you. I will live to testify that you are still saving, still transforming, and still loving without end. His feet left the prison gate, but his heart turned toward a new path, a path of service. He had decided to use his life story to encourage those who were imprisoned, not only by four walls, but by despair, hatred, and sin. He believed that every testimony he shared would be like a seed, sown into the barren soil of people's hearts, and God would make that seed grow. On that day, he realized one thing: physical freedom is a blessing, but freedom in God is the most precious thing of all. He once thought that the day he was released from prison would be the happiest day of his life, but now he understood that true happiness does not come from leaving a place, but from stepping into a new life, a life where every day is an opportunity to walk in His light and grace. On the way back, the sunlight gilded his hair, and the gentle breeze caressed his skin. Everything around him seemed to whisper to him, "You are truly free." And deep down, he knew that, even though there were many unknowns ahead, as long as he had God, he would never return to the darkness. When the prison gates closed behind him, He not only left his past behind, but also stepped into a completely new journey. No more chains, no more cold walls, but he knew clearly, true freedom is not just about being able to walk on the streets, but about living with the meaning and mission that God has placed in his heart. On the first day back in the outside world, he clearly felt the scrutinizing eyes. Some people welcomed him, but some still kept their distance, skeptical of his change. He didn't blame them, because he understood that faith must be proven through life, not just through words, and he was ready to live such a life. He talked about the long nights in solitary confinement, when all hope was exhausted and God's light shone into the darkness. He talked about the true freedom that no prison can give, that only God can unlock the chains in the soul. Many people were silent, but he saw a small spark in their eyes, a spark that he believed God could ignite. This work was not easy. There were times he was flatly rejected. Some mocked him, saying he was just trying to show off to clean up his past. But he knew he wasn't doing it to please others, but out of a deep gratitude to the God who saved him. Every day he lived with a question in his heart: who can I touch with God's love today? And that question led him from small alleys to crowded halls. Wherever he was, he carried a message. No one is too far for God to save. No life is hopeless as long as he is there. He realized that the purpose of his life was no longer to run from the past or to prove to the world that he had changed. That purpose was to become a living proof of grace, that God is still at work, still redeeming, and still transforming lives that seem to be lost. Now, whenever he recalls the path he has traveled, he no longer feels pain or regret as before. Instead, he smiles because he knows that everything has been used by God to weave the story of a saved person, not to keep for himself, but to give to those who are longing for a new beginning. In the past, when someone asked about his life, he would often look down, speak vaguely, or intentionally hide shameful things. But now when he steps up to share or sits across from someone struggling in the darkness, he holds his head high and tells his story, not to show off the sinful days, but to let the listeners see one thing: God's grace is greater than any abyss. He doesn't start his story by saying what sins he committed or how he fell. He starts with a name: Jesus, the God who entered his life when everyone else had turned their backs. Every word he tells no longer carries the bitterness of the past, but is imbued with the sweetness of redemption. Once he was invited to share at a rehabilitation center. The eyes in front of him showed alertness, suspicion, and also fatigue. He understood that feeling because he himself had once sat in that position, hearing shouts but finding them empty. But when he started talking about his own sleepless nights, his times in the cell, the desperate moments when he wanted to end his life, the whole room fell silent. And when he talked about the day he knelt down to pray, feeling God's forgiving embrace, a few pairs of eyes began to well up with tears. He realized that a true testimony is not a story about himself, but a story about God in him. He didn't want to stir up pain for others to pity him, but to show them that if God could save him, he could also save them. Every time he tells his story, he feels his heart ablaze. Not because of the feeling of being the center of attention, but because he knows he is planting a seed of hope in someone's heart. Maybe they won't believe right away. Maybe they will forget his face, but he believes they won't forget the God he mentioned. Now he lives as a living letter of grace. People can read in his eyes a peace he never had before. People can feel through his every word that he is no longer the old person. And he knows that his life will continue to be a living testimony until his last breath. If you are reading these words and feel that you are imprisoned, whether in visible iron bars or invisible chains of the past, sin, and despair, then know that hope still remains. God's arm is still reaching out. Open your heart. Call out to him right now. He doesn't demand that you be perfect to come to him. He comes to renew you, to bind up the deepest wounds and to put you on the path of true life. Don't wait until things are better to seek God. Come to him today, because maybe just like me, you will realize that the day you give your life to God is the day true freedom begins.